Hello, my name is Nathan Brummel. I'm coming to you from Indiana. Today we are going to talk about the ethic that should define the Christian approach to the political sphere, to the civil kingdom. There have been some questions about what is the nature of the Christian ethic that should be used in the political realm. And we're going to see today that it is, in fact, the Christian love ethic, which should be operative within the sphere of politics, within not only the sphere of our individual lives, not only should it be in the family that there should be a Christian love ethic of seeking the welfare of our other family members, but the same ethic also should occur within the workaday world and also in the political realm. Now, I have a book in my hands which is called Reforming Criminal Justice, and the author of this rather new book is Matthew Martins. And Matthew Martins has a Christian proposal for reforming criminal justice, and what is striking about this book is that he begins, and I'll talk about this matter at a different time, that he talks about how a robust approach to criminal justice reform involves Christians recognizing that they have a call to sanctification within the sphere of the criminal justice realm. And he also makes clear that the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ is not limited to justification, but also includes sanctification, and therefore it involves saints loving their neighbor within the criminal justice system. What is striking, though, compared to many other books that are on the topic of reforming criminal justice, is that he emphasizes the need for a Christian love ethic. Now, that is something striking. That's something I do not hear in the political sphere. I do not hear politicians in Indiana or Illinois talking about how Christian love, or any type of love, is supposed to function as an ethic within the court systems, or with respect to victims, or with respect to the prisons. But that's exactly what Martins does. Martins begins this book early on talking about how we need to have a Christian ethic of criminal justice. And what he says here is relevant for the political realm as well. And he says that we need a Christian ethic, and he argues that that Christian ethic should be an ethic of love. And so he begins by going back to the Old Testament, and he talks about how in the Old Testament, of course, we already are commanded to love our neighbor as ourself. And Jesus, of course, famously emphasized that when he was asked, what is the greatest commandment? Well, he said it's to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And then Martins goes through the various commandments and keeps making the point that when you keep a commandment, what you are basically doing is loving the neighbor, and when you break a commandment, you are hating the neighbor. He says the command not to murder is a command to love your neighbor. The command not to steal is a command to love your neighbor, and so on and so forth. And then he also talks about the relationship between justice and love. And what he begins to argue is that, in fact, if you act in a loving manner, you will act in a manner that is just. He does develop the concept of justice a little bit by quoting others like Augustine, the church father, who said that justice is giving everyone his due. And then Martins makes a lot out of the fact that the Apostle Paul says that what we owe to our neighbor is love. And so he says, government that acts on the principle of love for neighbor is government to which the citizenry is due as a matter of justice. And then he also quotes from Aquinas, who connected justice with seeking the welfare of other people and seeking the public good. Now, so he's doing something important here by developing this idea of a love ethic. I mean, it's a stunning thing. He emphasizes that, guess what? We owe to victims of crime. We owe to them love. And he even emphasizes that everybody who lives in the state of Indiana, in some sense, owes love to all of the victims in the state of Indiana. Although he does talk about how there is a certain proximity that comes to the neighbor with whom we have contact. And he emphasizes what is most controversial, of course, to the ordinary American, is that he argues that a criminal defendant is also owed love. Now, that's a topic that is not something you hear every day. Later on, once he develops this idea of loving the neighbor, he talks about several ways in which we can love the neighbor, and this includes loving both the victim and the accused. And he says there are 5 biblical pillars of justice which we need to follow in order to properly love the neighbor. The first one is accuracy. So he talks about how in a court of law, what needs to happen? Well, there needs to be accuracy so that it can be determined that the accused person, did he actually do the crime or not? Secondly, due process, something we find in the Bible too. Also accountability, and then impartiality. That's something needs to operate with juries and with judges. And then proportionality, that is, let the punishment fit the crime. But he says these all stand on the foundation of neighborly love. And so he's emphasizing this idea that we ought to have a Christian love ethic that operates within the whole sphere of criminal justice. Now, he's, of course, onto something important here, and he's onto something that we don't hear the secularists talking about. Now, why is it that we don't hear secularists talking about love? Well, of course, the problem is that the Christian love ethic is so powerfully grounded in what the Apostle John says in 1 John chapter 4, which is that God is love. And the Son of God is called God's beloved Son. This is my Son, he says, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. And so, see, this category of love goes back to the Holy Trinity. But we don't hear secularists talking in those terms. We do hear more talk about justice. But Martins, therefore, emphasizes this love ethic. Now, I think he ends up taking it a little bit too far, partly because he tries to relate love and justice, and there certainly are important ways in which those two concepts can and must be related. But I don't think he appreciates, like he ought to, how they are at the same time distinct concepts. And in fact, there can be a time when you are acting in a just manner, which isn't loving. In fact, instead, you might be acting in a just manner that leads to a punishment and an execution, as a magistrate carries out what the Apostle Paul calls in Romans 13, the wrath of God. Now, that is not a matter of love. It is a matter of justice. But listen to what Martin says. He says, to render biblical justice is to love your neighbor. And this is true not only for justice at the individual level, but also at the collective level. He said right before that the Christian scriptures, he says, teach that the end of the law is love, and a legal system is just only to the extent that it is loving. Now, of course, there's a lot to that. A justice system needs to be loving in the sense that it loves the victims of crime. It needs to be loving in that it is fair towards the accused. And it is also the case that it is loving because God is honored and God is loved when justice is done in the land, and when victims are vindicated, and when criminals are held accountable. But he overstates things. He says government acts justly only when it acts lovingly, and that's where he overstates things. Now he wrestles with the fact, he kind of senses, I think, that the use of physical force or coercive force by the magistrates, when the police arrest someone, that doesn't look so loving. Well, he says God ordained government and authorized it to punish crime by use of physical force, but he demanded that it do so with love as its goal, even when physical coercion is its means. The whole law, including the criminal law, hangs on love. Now, once again, there's a lot to that, and there's a lot we need to hear there. And it's true that we need to seek the welfare of our neighbor, but wait a minute. We also need to take into consideration the fact that there are times within the judicial realm and within the prison systems that we do simply have retributive justice. That is, where the vengeance of God is being manifested through humans as means who also punish. And of course, that punishment is pictured in the Bible by the exercise of the sword. And it's pure utter nonsense to say that this type of stuff directed at wicked, unrepentant men is somehow an act of love. No, it's not an act of love, but it is an act of vengeance, and it is an act of righteous judgment. But at the same time, Martens has done a very good service to Christians by emphasizing the fact that there ought to be an ethic of love that operates in the realm of the criminal justice system. Now, he was not only a prosecutor, but he also was a defense lawyer. And as a defense lawyer, he recognized, of course, the importance of having lawyers for defendants. Sometimes people would ask him, how could you possibly, defend a person, who has done some great crime or has been accused of some crime, of course, what was going on. But his response is that, well, his job is to help make sure that there is accuracy, for example. That's what should be happening in the criminal court so that justice can be done. So he talks about how, therefore, yes, we have two neighbors, and this is something that people don't always recognize. We have two neighbors that we need to love in the civic realm here when it comes to matters of crime and punishment. And those two neighbors are the victim and the perpetrator, both of them. He says, but our love they are due. To put a finer point on this, every single criminal defendant who has passed through the criminal justice system in your home state this year is entitled to love, and every single crime victim in your home state this year is entitled to love. Not just somebody else's love, your love. So he talks about the fact that both are owed love. And I think, I'm a little more tempted to say, yes, they're both owed love, but they're also both owed justice. And I say that because, let's say the victim has made a false claim. Okay, well, that needs to be dealt with in a proper way. And what if the defendant, in fact, is not guilty? Or if he is guilty, then he might need to have some serious punishments, which will not be loving, happy things that are done to him. No, they will be punishments that will not serve his welfare. But he says at the end of this the chapter on my neighbor, he says a just legal system must be one designed to love our neighbors, both the victim and the accused, by seeking their good. Now, there's something very important about that statement, and I think he's emphasizing this because we live in a time where people are not thinking in terms of seeking the good of both the victim and the accused. And that's, of course, an important thing. We ought to seek the welfare, where possible, of not only the victims, but also of men who have been accused, men who have been found guilty, men who are incarcerated, let's say, with a life sentence. Okay, how can we seek their good? But at the same time, this is missing out on something else that's important, which is simply that, no, when it comes to carrying out justice in the courts, and justice, even, let's say in the prison, there's a man who has already a life sentence, and then he attacks and tries to murder another man who is incarcerated with him. Okay, there need to be consequences. And when a man is placed in solitary confinement long term, that's not an act of love towards him. No, it is an act of justice and righteous judgment. But nevertheless, Martins in his book is doing a lot of good stuff. We're going to talk a little more about the good stuff that is found earlier on when he is laying out really a kingdom theology. Here he's writing a book about reforming criminal justice, but really he ends up talking about a positive Christian kingdom theology and why Christians should be involved in the realm of criminal justice, with really what he is saying is a full-fledged kingdom theology, a reformed kingdom theology. And he is absolutely right to talk about the importance of a love ethic that is so needed within the prison systems, for example. Did you know that often the reason why guards in prisons have a rough day is not because of how the individuals in custody are acting. No, it's because of how their fellow guards are acting. Guards who are just plain unloving and mean just make life miserable for other guards. And clearly you don't see that any type of ethic of love operating in the type of guards who just are constantly causing trouble and problems for other guards. They don't do their job properly. They aren't willing to assist other guards. It creates a miserable situation. And so, no, it's also the case that guards need to think in terms of a love ethic. In fact, if guards would act in a respectful way towards the individuals in custody, that would in fact make it so that prisons could be a safer place. What undermines security institution? Well, it's where you have guards who are mistreating individuals in custody, and the result is that there can be a whiplash. So yes, it is very important that there is a love ethic, and that should be emphasized within also the realm of the prisons. Now, John Calvin also emphasizes the importance of love and a love ethic for the civil sphere. Martins even quotes Calvin saying that laws that are made by governments are always to be tested by the rule of charity. So note that statement. Calvin is saying that when your state senators and representatives and governors make laws, they should be tested by the rule of charity. In Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, in Book 4, Chapter 20, and Article 15, he talks about this. He talks about the sort of love ethic that should impact our criminal justice systems and the laws that are on the books. He says, talking about the Old Testament civil laws, there were laws that governed Israel since they were a theocratic nation. Those civil laws no longer apply for us in the New Covenant, even though those civil laws have certain good principles in them. For example, there are civil laws that talk about how, if you dig a hole and you leave it uncovered and your neighbor's animal falls into it, well, there are consequences for you. You need to basically reimburse your neighbor for his animal. Well, Calvin says when these judicial laws were taken away, the perpetual duties and precepts of love could still remain. So what he's saying is behind those civil laws were precepts that had to do with loving your neighbor and loving your neighbor's property. So you don't dig a deep hole and then leave it for little kids or the neighbor's animals to fall in. And then he talks about how, there's a certain liberty in the New Covenant for nations and states to make laws that they consider to be profitable. He says, but if this is true, surely every nation is left free to make such laws as it foresees to be profitable for itself. Yet these must be in conformity to that perpetual rule of love, so that they indeed vary in form but have the same purpose. So there he says the same thing again. He says that whatever laws are made by our states, they need to be in conformity with their perpetual rule of love, which, of course, is a rule of love that comes out of the Ten Commandments, out of the two tables of the law. Now we come to something that's very important. Calvin argues that, in fact, both tables of the law are relevant for the civil sphere. He talks about how both tables of the law, the first table which has to do with loving God, and then the second table that deal with loving the neighbor, both of them, he says, are to be applied in the civil sphere. He says, if Scripture, this is in Book 4, Chapter 20, Article 9, he says, if Scripture did not teach that it extends to both tables of the law, we could learn this from secular writers. For no one has discussed the office of magistrates, the making of laws, and public welfare without beginning at religion and divine worship. And thus all have confessed that no government can be happily established unless piety is the first concern, and that those laws are preposterous which neglect God's right and provide only for men. And he talks about how if there is no love ethic with respect to the first table of the law, that is, loving God, he says, well, then there's not going to be justice among men either. So here, what he is doing is he's talking about how both tables of the law have to do with, should be part of the Christian ethic in the political sphere. Now, he goes too far with this because of his time and his place, and he says, also, holy kings are greatly praised in Scripture because they restored the worship of God when it was corrupted or destroyed, and so on. So he talks there about how, kings played a role in restoring worship and dealing with people who were pushing for idolatry. But that, of course, is due to his time and his place. But still, the major point that Calvin is making here is that both tables of the law are relevant for the public sphere. And Calvin has a lot to say about an ethic of love. In fact, he spends a lot of time in his Institutes on the Ten Commandments. And he makes clear that the two tables of the law both deal with love, and that love ethic, both tables have implications for civil government. So what is striking here too, there's another thing going on, which I want to bring to your attention, is that both Calvin and Martins are emphasizing that in the civil realm, guess what? We ought to love our neighbor as ourselves. Now, that's very striking because they're arguing that, no, we ought to love the neighbor. Notice they are not saying that in the public sphere, the only thing we should do is exercise bare justice. Now, here is where two-kingdom theology comes in. There are advocates of two-kingdom theology that I'm aware of who are saying that in the civil kingdom, that is in the political sphere, guess what operates? Only justice. They say, just the covenant of works is operative within the civil sphere, and therefore the only thing that is operative there is justice. Not mercy, not grace, and we really could say then not the sort of love either then that leads to grace or leads to mercy. And advocates of two-kingdom theology will be so dramatic that they will bifurcate reality. They will say, well, in the civil sphere, in the political sphere, justice operates. In the sphere of the church as institute, grace operates. So they draw this huge difference between the two spheres. No, the reality is that also in the civil sphere, love should operate. And where love operates, guess what there will be at times? Something called mercy. Something called grace. It means that judges will not sentence defendants to the sentence they could give to them because they see evidences of change, for example, in a man's life. Or why might it be that a governor would grant a pardon? That's serious clemency. That's serious mercy. It's serious grace. Well, sometimes it is the glory of kings to show mercy and clemency like that. So yes, it's true that justice operates within the civil realm too, but also, mercy is going to be operative there as well. And let's say you were in politics. If you're in the sphere of politics, if you're a politician, is your approach going to be, I am only going to exercise justice with respect to my political opponents? No, there's a time for showing mercy to your political opponents. There's a time to be forgiving to your political opponents. There is a time for seeking the welfare even of your political opponents. There's a time for graciousness towards your political opponents. No, both justice and love should function within the civil realm. Now, what's our takeaway from all this then? Well, the first takeaway is that in the civil realm, it is not a sphere where it is simply a sphere of bare justice, as some two-kingdom theology advocates have claimed. No, it's also a sphere where Christians, especially who are in the civil sphere, whether they are governors or whether they're senators, whether they're presidents, whatever their position might be, whether they're a judge in a local county, that there's a time for justice and there's a time for mercy. There's also a time for true, genuine love for the neighbor, whether the neighbor is the victim or an accused defendant or a man who has been found guilty of a crime. And then the other important takeaway is, yes, it's true. Martins is correct in emphasizing the importance of a love ethic within the criminal justice system and also within the civil realm. But he does make a mistake in thinking that every single act of every single magistrate has to be an act of love in order for it to be just. No, there are times when justice means that there will be a punitive punishment, that there will be punitive and retributive justice, which is not seeking the welfare of a person who is guilty of a crime and in fact is manifesting what Romans chapter 13 calls the wrath of God. Well, I hope you're beginning to learn a few things about kingdom theology, and we'll come back next time, and what we want to do is talk about the role that the doctrines of justification and sanctification ought to play in kingdom theology.